My son shoved me against my own front door the morning I told him no. Not a tap, not a frustrated grab. A real shove, both hands flat on my chest, hard enough that the deadbolt caught me right between the shoulder blades and I nearly went down. I stood there in my own doorway watching him walk back to his wife's waiting car, 31 years of knowing that face, and I didn't recognize the man I was looking at. I went inside and sat at the kitchen table and stared at the wall for about 10 minutes. Then I called my lawyer. His name is Jerome, and we'd worked together for 12 years, through my wife's illness, through her passing, through the contracts and disputes, and general complications of running an electrical contracting business for 3 decades. He answered on the second ring, same as always. Something in my voice must have told him this wasn't a billing question. He said, "Come in today, right now if you can." I want to back up, because none of this makes sense without the 4 years that came before it. My daughter-in-law came into my son's life at exactly the moment a person like her looks for. Sawyer had just gone through a breakup that took him about a year to recover from. He was 31, building something solid professionally, but a little lonely in the way that doesn't announce itself. Just shows up in how a person answers when you ask how they're doing. She was 36, and she was, I'll give her this, extraordinary at reading a room. She'd found him through a mutual connection at a work event in Nashville. 3 months later, she was driving up to Knoxville to meet me. She sat at my kitchen table and drank the coffee I poured and asked thoughtful questions about my late wife, about how I'd built the business, about what I thought made a marriage last. She had a way of making you feel like your answers mattered to her, like she was taking notes on you in the best possible sense. I liked her. I want to be honest about that. I thought my son had found someone serious. They married 14 months after they met. Small ceremony, outdoor venue east of the city. Sawyer looked happier than I'd seen him in years. I gave them $35,000 toward the down payment on their house. I was glad to do it. That's what the money was for. The investment conversation started about a year into the marriage. Her family had a development background. Commercial real estate, she said, strip malls and mixed-use conversions, the kind of unglamorous but reliable work that doesn't make headlines but generates steady returns. There was a specific opportunity, a property outside Charlotte, a conversion project with a community development angle that gave it favorable financing terms. The projected returns were realistic. She was careful not to oversell, and she brought documentation that looked exactly like what documentation from a legitimate operation looks like. She laid it all out at my kitchen table. I asked questions. She answered every one. Sawyer sat beside her and filled in details, and I remember thinking they'd clearly talked this through together, that he understood the investment well enough to speak to it. I didn't understand until much later that she had rehearsed him, that every question I might raise was one she'd coached him to anticipate and reinforce. I wasn't comfortable enough to put my own money in. I said so. She said she respected that completely, that they would move forward with Sawyer's retirement savings and revisit the conversation after the first phase performed. Sawyer liquidated his 401(k), all of it, $295,000 he'd been building since his first job out of college, plus the early withdrawal penalty, plus the taxes. He wired what remained to an LLC she controlled. 3 weeks later, the deal fell through. That was the phrase she used when she came to my door alone on a Wednesday morning. The deal fell through. Regulatory complications, a financing partner who'd pulled back, language she produced with the fluency of someone who'd spoken it before. She said they were in a difficult position. She said they needed somewhere to stay while they regrouped, just for a little while. I asked where my son was. She said he was embarrassed and couldn't face me yet. I told her no. She left without a scene. Her face did something I couldn't entirely read, a brief stillness, like a recalculation, and then she thanked me for my time and walked to her car. 3 hours later, Sawyer pulled into my driveway. Whatever she'd told him on the phone, it had worked. He was furious in a way I'd never seen from him, not even as a teenager. He stood on my porch and told me I was abandoning them, that I was punishing him for a mistake that could have happened to anyone, that a father who loved his son would at least give them a roof while they figured it out. I said no again quietly, because there was nothing loud to say, and that's when both hands hit my chest, and I went back into the door. He walked away. I went inside. I called Jerome. Jerome had run a background check on her 6 months earlier, when the investment pressure first started feeling wrong to me. I'd asked him to look and then told him not to share anything unless something urgent came up. He'd been sitting on what he found. He opened a folder and placed a photograph on the desk between us. The woman in the photo was younger looking. Same face, different hair, a different city behind her. Standing beside her was a man who was probably 60, heavy-set, kind-looking in the way of people who've spent their lives being trusting. Her name wasn't Gemma Ashford, it was Gemma Walcott. She'd changed it legally after her second marriage dissolved. The first husband was from Louisville. She'd met him through mutual connections, married him inside 8 months, and he died of a cardiac event 18 months after the wedding. Before he died, he'd transferred $180,000 to an investment account she managed. The account was emptied the week of his funeral. His adult children had contested it. Nothing was ever proven. Jerome placed a second photograph on the desk. A man in his mid-60s from outside Nashville, prosperous-looking, photographed at some kind of backyard gathering. She'd stayed with him longer, and longer meant more access. He lost $225,000 to a medical technology startup. The startup didn't exist. He was still in litigation when Jerome's investigator found him. They'd been watching for something like this. I sat there doing the math and trying not to think too hard about what the math meant. Then Jerome told me something that made the ground feel uncertain beneath my feet. His investigator had found a social media account, years old, mostly dormant, where she had posted about visiting Knoxville. She'd used phrases like scouting for opportunities and community investment research. The post was dated 8 months before she met my son at that work event in Nashville. She hadn't found my son and then found me. She'd found me, my business, my assets, my recently widowed status, and then positioned herself to find my son. I thought about every question she'd asked at my kitchen table, about the business, about the house, about my retirement plans. I'd thought she was being warm interested, the kind of person who wanted to understand the family she was marrying into. Jerome kept going. A document had been filed at a bank branch about 40 minutes from my house. It carried my signature, a forged one, Jerome said, but a convincing one, and it authorized a home equity line of credit on my property. I own my house free and clear. I paid off that mortgage 11 years ago. According to this document, I had agreed to borrow $58,000 against it and transfer the funds to a joint account held by my son and his wife. I had never signed any such thing. A new loan officer at a small branch had processed it without proper verification. That $58,000 was gone, moved to the same offshore accounts as the retirement money. So at that point the total was $353,000 taken from my family, $295,000 from my son's future, $58,000 from mine, extracted through forgery while I sat in my own house thinking everything was fine. Jerome paused. Then he said there was something else, and the way he said it told me this was the part he'd been building toward. My son had been bringing me supplements for the past year. This had started after she'd told Sawyer that she'd had a cardiologist friend review some general information about my health history and that there were specific things I should be taking for my heart. Green powder, a capsule or two. I'd taken them without question every month because my son had brought them, and because what kind of man thinks twice about something his kid drives 40 minutes to deliver out of what looks like care? Jerome slid a lab report across the desk. My physician had run blood work on an emergency basis that morning. Diphenhydramine, alprazolam, both present. Low doses, cumulative, calibrated not to incapacitate but to soften, to keep a person agreeable, a little foggy, less likely to push back at the moments that counted. My son had been delivering his father's sedatives once a month. He hadn't known. I sat with that. Jerome let me. There was also a guardianship petition filed under my son's name, claiming I was showing signs of cognitive decline and required oversight of my financial decisions. Attached were medical records, fabricated, Jerome confirmed, from a specialist I had never seen, documenting early-stage dementia. She had planned for the possibility that I would say no. She'd been constructing a way to take what she wanted through the court system, if she couldn't get it through conversation. And there was an insurance application, life insurance, my son's name as policyholder, herself as primary beneficiary, that had been submitted and rejected only because I would have needed to appear in person for the medical exam. Jerome said, "I want you to understand what we're dealing with. This is not a woman who made a series of bad decisions. This is a woman who does this deliberately, who has done it before, and who chose your family specifically because your son trusted you completely, and that trust was something she could use." I asked him what we did now. He said the restraining order first, then the will. Then we needed to decide how public to take this, because in his professional judgment, exposure was the only thing that actually stopped someone built the way she was. I didn't tell Jerome what I planned to do before I did it. First, I called my son. We met at a diner we'd been going to since he was in high school. Corner booth, coffee that was never quite hot enough, pie that was always better than it had any right to be. He came in looking like he hadn't slept in 2 days. His eyes went to my shoulder when I shifted in the booth. I put the folder on the table and let him read it. I watched his face go through about 14 things in 5 minutes. The photographs of the men before him, the lab results with his name written next to supplements delivered by, the forged signature, the guardianship petition filed under his name, the insurance application. He read the supplement section twice. He said quietly, "She told me those came from a cardiologist she trusted personally. She said you were at risk and you wouldn't listen when family brought it up, but you'd take something if I brought it." I said, "I know." He said, "Dad, I brought those to you every month. I sat at your table and watched you take them." I said, "I know that too." He put his head in his hands and sat there for a while. The coffee went cold between us. When he looked up, his eyes were red, and he looked more like the 12-year-old version of himself than the man who'd shoved me against a door 36 hours earlier. He said, "She had a translation for everything you said or did. If you were skeptical about the investment, that was you having trouble trusting her, and I needed to be patient. If you seemed a little off on the phone, that was the stress of living alone." He stopped for a moment. "She was always explaining you to me. I stopped actually listening to you somewhere along the way, and I didn't notice when it happened." I asked if he understood what the folder in front of him meant. He said yes, clean, no negotiation about it. I told him what I needed from him. He said, "Whatever it is, tell me." The restraining order was filed by 3 o'clock that afternoon. Jerome's investigator compiled the full evidence package and reached out to a reporter at the Knoxville paper who covered financial crimes and elder abuse. She'd been working on a broader piece about the pattern for months and had been waiting for a case she could document completely. The story ran on a Thursday morning under the headline, "Woman Accused of Targeting Widowers in 3-State Financial Scheme." It named her. It laid out the previous marriages with dollar figures. It described the forged documents, the supplements, the guardianship petition. Jerome had spent 3 days verifying every claim before anything went to print. The response came fast and from directions I hadn't anticipated. My neighbor, a woman I'd known for 9 years, who'd brought food when my wife was in hospice and helped me sort through an entire garage after she died, knocked on my door the evening the article ran. She told me that my daughter-in-law had been calling her regularly for months, expressing concern, telling her I seemed forgetful, that the family was worried about some financial decisions I'd been making, that they were trying to figure out how to help me. My neighbor had been quietly worried about me, based entirely on those conversations. When she understood what had actually happened, the expression on her face moved from confusion through something that looked like personal fury. 2 other people contacted Jerome's office inside of a week. One had attempted to do business with her during her time in Nashville and had found inconsistencies that never resolved into anything he could name at the time. Another had been a neighbor of the second husband and had observed things she'd never had context to understand. Both were willing to talk to federal investigators. The Nashville attorney had already been in contact with Jerome. They filed a joint complaint. The guardianship petition was withdrawn before the following week ended. She attempted to access the joint account she and my son held at a regional bank. The account had been flagged when she initiated a wire transfer of the remaining balance, $11,000, which was all that was left of everything between them. The transaction was held pending review, and the branch manager called the contact number on file. Jerome's office. The FBI's Financial Crimes Unit had been watching her since the Louisville case. They'd had account trails, but no connective tissue between the marriages. The article gave them what they needed. She was arrested at a gate in Hartsfield-Jackson in Atlanta 14 days after the story ran. She was boarding a one-way flight to Lisbon. She had cash, a passport, and a name that didn't match any of the identities Jerome's investigator had connected to her, and a phone with no personal data on it at all. My son was sitting across from Jerome in the conference room when the call came in. He exhaled in a way that sounded like he'd been holding his breath for months. The legal process ran the better part of a year. Charges in 3 states: federal wire fraud, identity theft, elder financial abuse. The offshore accounts were traced as far as the FBI could trace them, which wasn't as far as we needed. They recovered $94,000, about a quarter of the $353,000 she'd taken. It's not nothing, it's not close to whole. My son will spend years putting his finances back together. Some of what she cost him doesn't have a number attached to it. He stayed in my guest room for 4 months while he found his footing. We ate dinner together most evenings. He fixed the back fence that had been slowly giving up since the previous fall. We watched television and talked when it felt right, and mostly it did. Around the 2nd month, he told me he'd been going back through his memories, looking for the moment when the truth had been available to him. The day he could have seen it if he'd been paying closer attention. I told him that's not how it works. She built her entire operation on making the truth invisible to the people inside it. Being a trusting person isn't a flaw. It was exactly what she selected for. It was the thing she needed him to be. He didn't respond right away, but something in his posture shifted, like he'd been carrying something and quietly set it down. By spring, he had an apartment on the east side of the city, a new position with a firm that does corporate auditing, the irony of which is not lost on either of us. He called on a Sunday evening to say he was okay, and I believed him the way you believe something, not because it's convenient, but because it's simply true. She received 11 years, consolidated across the federal charges. The attorney from the Nashville case told Jerome it was the longest sentence that had been secured from any of her prior victims. The men she'd targeted before, the ones who'd survived, had never been able to connect the cases the way ours were connected. We'd moved fast enough. We'd had everything documented. The $94,000 recovered sits in a separate account, and I'm still deciding what to do with it. Most of it traces back to my son's retirement savings. Part of me wants to hand it to him directly. Another part of me thinks there's a right way and a wrong way to give a person something after something like this, and I'm not in a hurry to get that wrong. Jerome and I updated my estate documents last month. Clean, properly structured with safeguards that make it resistant to the kind of legal challenges she'd been preparing. When we finished, he asked if I had any questions. I had one. I asked him how a person comes out the other side of this without becoming someone who can't trust anything anymore. He thought about it for a moment. Jerome is not usually a man who gives advice outside his professional lane. But he said, I think you figure out what you actually did when it counted, and you decide that was the right thing, and then you let the rest of it belong to the past where it happened. What I did was say no, twice when it cost something real to say it. I held a line I didn't even know I was holding until my son's hands were on my chest, and I understood that some lines, once you let them move, break something essential on the way out. I spend more time in the garden now than I used to. My wife kept it. Tomatoes, sweet peppers, a few herbs she put in everything she cooked. I let it go after she died, which I understood at the time and understand less now. This spring I put it back. The tomatoes are coming along well. The peppers need a sunnier corner, and I'm going to have to rethink the layout before next year. My son came over 2 weekends ago. We got the last of the seedlings into the ground, the ones that had been sitting in starter trays waiting on the final frost to pass. He got dirt on his jeans and complained about it in exactly the same voice he used when he was 9 years old doing something similar, and I laughed in a way I hadn't in a long time. Just a laugh. Nothing underneath it but what it was. There are things she took that aren't coming back, the money mostly, but also a certain ease, the way you used to feel opening your door without stopping to think about it first. That's going to take longer to return than the garden did. Maybe it takes the rest of my life. I don't know yet. What I know is this: the coffee I make in my own kitchen with my own hands tastes exactly like it always has. The garden is growing. The fence my son fixed is straight again. He comes over on Sundays. That's enough. For now in this season, that is more than enough.